In the late 1980s, if you were exposed to Tetris, it probably came in the form of the version for the Game Boy. As the pack-in title for the original handheld system, the Game Boy version of Tetris shipped more than 35 million copies. For a game that started as a side project for Russian programmer Alexei Pajitnov, that is quite the accomplishment. However, the road from obscurity to one of the most ubiquitous titles of all time was a winding one with massive confusion over rights, 2 versions of the game being released on the NES, a 3-person race to Moscow, and a legal showdown between the reigning king of gaming, Nintendo, and its predecessor, Atari. Today on Arcadology, we're talking about the battle for Tetris. There are 4 main players in this story. They are Alexei Pajitnov, the creator, Robert Stein, president of Andromeda, Hank Rogers of Bulletproof Software, and Kevin Maxwell of Mirrorsoft. Let's start with Pajitnov. In the early 80s, Alexei Pajitnov worked as a researcher for the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. According to him, he was just a typical programmer, overworked and obsessive over his job. One of Pajitnov's responsibilities was testing the capabilities of the Academy's computers by programming small games into them. While testing the Electronica 60, which was a clone of the PDP-11, Pajitnov decided to create a game based on one of his childhood hobbies of pentamino puzzles. A pentamino is a shape made of 5 squares. Early on, however, Pajitnov decided that pentaminos would be too much for the low-end system to be able to handle, and he took one of the squares off. These shapes would be called tetraminos, of which there are 7. This is also where the title Tetris comes from, tetra meaning 4. It didn't take long before Pajitnov had a working version of the game, around 3 weeks, but this first version of the game was made out of alphanumeric characters because the Electronica 60 did not support graphics. A colleague of Pajitnov's, Vadim Gerasimov, would port the game to the IBM-compatible PC that the department had received. With a mostly complete version of the game, Pajitnov wanted to release it but had no idea how. So he started just sending the game around to people with computers around Moscow and eventually the other Eastern Bloc nations. Eventually, a copy would find its way to the Institute of Computer Science in Budapest, Hungary, where it would be discovered by the second person I mentioned at the start, Robert Stein. Robert Stein was the president of UK-based game publisher Andromeda. Originally from Hungary, Stein had left when he was 22 years old and moved to the UK. He built Andromeda by importing and publishing games from his native Hungary. On one particular trip to the Institute of Computer Science in 1986, Stein saw Tetris and recognized it as a potential blockbuster for Andromeda. Stein sent Pajitnov a telex, inquiring about the rights to the game. According to Russian law, however, Pajitnov was not allowed to give the rights. It would have to be negotiated through the state. Unfortunately for everyone involved, what followed was a costly miscommunication. In the book Replay, Pajitnov said, "My English wasn't very good. He sent the proposal of the license and I tried to answer him that I'm very glad he is interested and I like his proposal and we need to start negotiation, which I assumed was a necessary stage for any agreement. But somehow he interprets my answer as an agreement to his terms." Stein mistook whatever Pajitnov's answer was to be a complete agreement to terms. What followed were a set of license agreements built upon a foundation of quicksand as Stein licensed the game to Mirrorsoft and Spectrum Holobyte. The rights to the game spread from company to company, including Atari, Sega, and Hank Rogers' Bulletproof Software, which would produce the Famicom version of the game. Hank Rogers noticed that there were no handheld rights that had been purchased yet, so he approached first Mirrorsoft and then Stein in order to get them. Because he knew that Gunpei Yokoi's Game Boy was going to be coming out soon for Nintendo, and he felt that Tetris would be the perfect pack-in game for it. Stein avoided Rogers for as long as possible because he had been informed that the initial deal with Pajitnov had been void, and he was trying to work out a deal with L-Org, the state-run agency that had taken over negotiations for the licensing of Tetris. Rogers, growing wary of Stein's evasiveness, decided to instead negotiate for the handheld rights directly from L-Org. Concurrent with the separate efforts of Rogers and Stein, Kevin Maxwell, the son of Mirrorsoft boss Robert Maxwell, had joined in the fray in an effort to negotiate directly with the Russians. The 3 converged on L-Org headquarters and ended up with meetings on the same day. Rogers, first one in, ended up walking away with what he sought, but not just the handheld rights, but the console rights. Mirrorsoft was left holding only the computer rights to the game, with the contract specifically cutting them out from console licensing. Stein was left with nothing. All this would become a big problem for one company in particular, Atari. Sure, all the other companies were going to no doubt feel like they had been taken for a ride, but Atari, through its console game company Tengen, was about to release a Tetris game for the NES designed by legendary game designer Ed Logg of Asteroids fame. In the years of Nintendo's dominance, the company held a pretty tight leash over the companies looking to publish on their console. I won't go into too much detail because that's a whole nother video, but suffice to say Tengen and Trammell were not willing to abide by Nintendo's rules. So Tengen reverse engineered the Nintendo and figured out a way to bypass the security chip that prevented companies from publishing their own games. Nintendo and Tengen were in the middle of a lawsuit regarding this when the whole Tetris debacle broke out. Atari decided to ignore Nintendo's new license and launched a lawsuit against the gaming giant, claiming their right to release the game in April of 1989, and then released their version of Tetris in May of '89. Nintendo countersued, and 1 month after the game's release, it was banned from store shelves. A judge ordered Tengen recall all copies sold and destroy them even though 100,000 copies were already out in the wild. Nintendo would go on to release the Game Boy version of the game in July, a month after Atari's defeat, and the console version of the game in November. Over 35 million copies of the Game Boy version of Tetris would be sent out with the Game Boy over the lifespan of the device. So, what happened to Alexei Pajitnov? In 1996, the license owned by Nintendo expired, and the rights, no longer under control of the Russian government, reverted back to Pajitnov. With the rights firmly under his control, Pajitnov, with the help of Hank Rogers, formed the Tetris Corporation, which has overseen all the licensing for Tetris since. And what of the Tengen version of Tetris? Well, according to some sources, most of the copies eventually were destroyed as per the court order. It's a shame to consider that we missed out on what was considered the best version of Tetris in that generation. Well, that's it for today's episode of Arcadology. And while you're here, why not check out this video of the history of Space Invaders that I put together a while back? Or check out the rest of the Arcadology series. If you want to reach out to me, Twitter is the best way, @SpoilerKevin, or simply leave a comment at the bottom of this video. Thanks for watching, and take care.